Welcome everybody to our first Facebook Live screening. We today are going to be looking into a native beehive. It's a bit of a strange time of season to be looking into a native beehive. It's starting to cool down, but thankfully here in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, we've got beautiful blue skies and we've got happy bees as well. So in the coolest states of Australia, I probably wouldn't be recommending going into a native beehive at this time of year, because the temperatures can be quite harsh on them. But today we're blessed by the nature gods, and we are very thankful that we're going to be opening a hive. My name's Jack. I'm from B1/3 Neighbourhood Honey. We're an urban beekeeping business here in southeast Queensland in Brisbane, and we work directly with West Village in managing their on-site beehives. We have 4 European beehives on the rooftops of West Village, and more to come next year, and we're even talking about getting some wonderful little native bees like the ones we have today all around the gardens there. So we can, as visitors to West Village, we can actually be engaging with the bees at head height. We as children, we as parents can be learning about the importance of bees within our ecosystem, and we can watch them coming and going, bringing back food to their colony. There are going to be many flowers planted throughout the West Village precinct that are going to be attracting bees, and it's going to be our job, and is our job, to be stewards of these bees. So we need to be able to respect nature, and in doing so we will respect the bees that are visiting those flowers and providing a very important thing to us as humans, and that thing is known as pollination. So native bees, they're very different to the regular bees that you might know, the golden black bees. The golden black bees are actually European honeybees, so they are from Europe, and the native bees are native to Australia. So they have been here for millennia, for millions and millions of years, and they are used to our climate and they're used to the environment that is here in Australia. Predominantly, these native bees that we're looking at today, known as social native bees, they live in a social setting as a colony inside a small box like this one that we see here, and they live for each other, by each other, for each other. There is a queen inside this hive. There are many female daughters known as the worker bees, and they perform all of the roles inside the hive. And then there are the drone bees, and the drone bees are the male bees, and their main and only role inside the hive is to fertilize the queens. So they are essentially the holders of the genetics of the hive. One thing that I would really like to draw your attention to before we jump into this is, if you are interested in getting into native bees and having a native beehive in your backyard or on your balcony like we do have here at my home in the middle of Brisbane City, if you're interested in getting a native beehive for your backyard or your balcony or your veggie patch, I would highly recommend looking into getting a book and learning about the native bees, doing as much reading as you possibly can. We have a wonderful book, the Australian Native Bee Book by Tim Hurd, who is, funnily enough, a West End local here in Brisbane. He's one of the leading entomologists in Australia when it comes to native bee species. And that's quite a feat, to be one of the leading entomologists for native bees, because little do we know that there are close to 2,000 different species of native bees that are native to Australia. It's not just one, like the one here today. It's not 2. It's 2,000 different species native to Australia. On a global scale, there are actually 25,000 different species of bees all over the world. All over in America, in South America, in Europe, in Africa, all through Asia. So bees are quite diverse. Bees are incredibly complex, and they must not be mistaken for their counterpart, I guess, the wasp. So wasps and bees are very different. That is one thing that we must know, is that when we see insects in our garden, when they're visiting our flowers and our veggie patches, the trees on the street as we walk to school and we walk to work, we must understand that every insect plays a role, but bees are the most effective and efficient at performing that vital act of pollination that we as humans rely on to grow our food, to produce things like oil and feed for our animals. Bees provide that pollination to have those luxuries in life. And without bees, we would not have foods like apples, oranges, we wouldn't have nuts like macadamias or almonds, we wouldn't have cherries or blueberries or strawberries, and simply we wouldn't have over 100 different fruits and vegetables, because all of those fruits and vegetables require a bee or an insect to visit that flower to provide the pollination, to transfer pollen from flower, to spread the genetics of that flower, of that plant, so it can then produce a healthy fruit. Without proper pollination, you get small apples, you get small oranges, you get almonds or macadamias that are not good for sale. So we rely on bees a huge amount, and I highly recommend either visiting our website or visiting Tim Hurd's website and ordering the Australian Native Bee book. It's a great read, and it goes through all aspects of native beekeeping. If you're interested in European bees, do visit our website at bee13.com.au, and we have a range of different educational books on there as well. So now, we might not know this, but on May the 20th, that is next Wednesday, 1 week from now, it's going to be World Bee Day. And World Bee Day is a global day that we celebrate what bees do for us when it comes to pollination and when it comes to just being such beautiful creatures that we can learn a lot from. So join us next Wednesday at a time to be revealed for a special insight for World Bee Day. So lock it in and be there. Now, what we're going to be looking into now is the native beehive. This native beehive, the species of native bees that these are, is a tetragonula Hocking's eye. Hocking's eye is a specific type of native bee species, and they have some very unique and special attributes, you could say. So, one thing, usually with a native beehive, we've got 3 layers. So what I've got here is an empty box to demonstrate. This is a 2-layer mating hive, so this is one that we use for replicating the hive over and over, season to season. But what we generally work in is a 3-tier hive. You've got your entrance hole at the front, another entrance hole in the middle level if you so desire, and then a top box. Now, the bottom 2 boxes are actually where the nest is built by the native bees. In the top box, you've got your honey storage. Your honey storage is really just the surplus. It's not the most important part of the beehive. In fact, we as beekeepers, we should not be searching for honey by keeping bees. We should be providing the bees with the best environment for them to provide pollination. And to do that, we need to provide them with the best amount of space to build their nest. So when we open up inside the hive, it really is quite simple. It's got a bottom box where the nest structure will live, and it's got these 2 bars that the nest structure will grow up into. And these 2 bars actually make it very easy for us to perform an act known as splitting, where we split the hive from one hive and we make a second hive off of that split. So bees are incredible. They naturally grow into the space that we give them. So if we take their hive and split it in half, then we can create a second hive by taking half of the colony away and putting an empty box underneath, and then putting an empty box on top of the one that we've just taken away. So above the nest structure, you've got 3 holes through a small separator board, and that separator board provides just enough room for those bees to crawl up and store any surplus nectar or pollen inside the honey box. Now, there's ample room inside this honey box. When it's full, it will provide about 800 grams to 1 kilogram of honey. So very interesting. That's a general 3-box oath hive, and these can be purchased from Tim Hurd's website as well if you're interested in looking for bees, or interested in purchasing an empty box if you happen to find a native beehive out in the wild that you're thinking about rescuing and transplanting into your backyard. So what we're going to do now is, another point, really important to use good timber and buy good timber, because as you can see here, we did an experiment with this hive many years ago Looks a bit rusty, but you can see how the timber that we've used, being an experiment, has split down the middle. Native bees and bees in general, they adapt. They understand that nature is nature and things happen. So they adapt and they actually seal up all these gaps and cracks, but it's best to use the best timber that you can find, and I think that Tim Herd definitely provides the best type of boxes. It's proven, they're resilient boxes, and they don't crack and split. So what we're going to be using is our little hive tool, and our hive tool is the main tool when it comes to opening and cracking and breaking open our hive. That's because it's hardened steel, it's very hardy, and the bees use a glue inside the hive to attach all of the openings. So this crack through the front here, around their entrance, around the ceiling and the lid, they glue everything together. So we need a strong tool that doesn't bend and doesn't break, so we can open it to have a look inside. Now what I'm doing, I'm slowly opening this hive up, and I can feel the resistance, the glue that the bees have built. Oh, and the aroma is beautiful as well. Oh, the smell of the honey, the smell of the pollen, the smell of what is known as the propolis. Now, as I slowly open that up, we're going to have a look inside the hive. Wow, look at that. Bees working away there. Now the tetragonula Hocking's eye are a very specific type of social bee. They live predominantly on the east coast of Australia, also found in South America as well. We have very similar climatic conditions to South America. Now these native bees, their main nest structure is between these two boxes, and you can see where their food is placed inside the hive, and also where their nest structure is placed inside the hive. Now, right in the center of this box, on the top part of the box and the bottom part of the box, is the main nest structure. And that nest structure is known as a brood structure. The brood is what we refer to as the small baby bees about to be born. You can also then see all of this beautiful webbing around the nest structure that the bees have built almost as a capsule to hold the nest together. And they're very curious on me. They're buzzing all around my face and they're attaching themselves to my hair. So this is what native bees do. They have no risk of harm, but what they do is they're very curious about us, about when we open their hive. They want to understand what's going on. So they don't sting, but they do have a little bite on them. I haven't been bitten yet, and I'll let you know when I am bitten. But it's not anything to be scared of or pose any danger. So what the bees do is they build their nest structure through the center of the hive, surrounded by this beautiful webbing, this beeswax and propolis webbing, and then they store their food around the outside of their nest structure. You can see the orange and the yellow and the webbing around. There's honey all through here as well. Ooh, the bees are getting into my eyes. This is a reality of beekeeping. You've got to be prepared for it. The pollen is the yellow and the red throughout the hive, and the pollen is what they use as a protein. And this pollen here is actually edible by us as well, and has a really beautiful, sweet but bitter taste to it. I'm going to throw on my head veil. I'm going to close this up quickly. I'm going to just throw on my head veil because the bees are getting quite intense. It's much more comfortable now. Wonderful. These head veils are only about $30 or $40 from a beekeeping store, and they're great because they just protect you from exactly what we're talking about and what we're experiencing now. Now the pollen, the red and the yellow food inside the hive, is actually pollen that the bees have gathered from flowers. They have gone out, they have searched for flowers in the area that are in flower, and they have found the pollen on the outside of the flower, on the stigma and the stamen of the flower. That pollen is actually the genetics of the flower that needs to be transferred by way of pollination that I spoke about earlier. They also collect something else when they visit the flower, and that is known as the nectar. The nectar is the carbohydrate or the sugar for the bees. Now, both types of food are really important for the bees. They need to find both carbohydrate, nectar, which we know as honey, and pollen, which they use as protein inside the hives. Because those two foods are the foods that are fed to the bees that are about to be born. So the baby eggs and the larvae and the pupa inside the hive, inside this nest structure, that's the main food source that are being fed to the ever-growing population inside the hive. Now the queen will lay many, many hundreds of eggs in a day, and there's about 5,000 to 6,000 bees inside this colony right now. Ooh, there's a little bite on the back of the neck. Ooh. Told you I'd tell you when I got bitten. It's taken a while, but they are relatively gentle. They're just crawling up my neck and hanging out in my hair. The importance of having enough for the bees to feed on in your area, I could not stress highly enough. It is really important that if you live in a very dry area of Australia where there's not many flowers and not many plants, that you be considerate of the fact that you might not be able to harvest honey in your first year of beekeeping, or you might not be able to harvest honey at all, because the primary reason for keeping bees is actually for them to provide pollination to us. If we take their food source away every couple of months or every year, then we run the risk actually of starving the bees, and the bees, all that hard work they've put into collecting food for the growth of their colony and the population control and population growth gets taken away from them, and they suffer. And that means we don't have pollinators around, which are so important. Now, usually this box would, in a regular 3-tier box, we'd have a honey super up top or a honey box up top, where we would be able to open up and taste some honey. But here you can also see around the top edge of this box is what's known as propolis. And propolis is an amazing product that the bees actually collect and store inside the hive. It is a glue, and it's a glue inside the hive to seal up all of the cracks. So when we place this box back together, the bees are going to be able to glue everything back together with the propolis. The propolis is also very medicinal as well. So another great product, as well as the wax that comes from this. So there's honey, pollen, there's propolis, there's wax, and there's the brood inside the hive. So I might close it up now because it is still a brisk day, but we might take some questions and see if we can answer some.
Yeah, great. So Jack, can you tell us if natives and European bees can live in the same area in relative harmony?
Oh, great question. So can native bees and European bees live in harmony together? Yes, the answer is absolutely, especially here in urban areas, in the city, where we've got a plethora, an abundance. We've got a lot of food for the bees to feed on. Native bees forage and fly for up to 500 metres from where their nest is located. And European bees, they fly for up to 5 kilometres from where their nest is located. So they're foraging in different areas and different distances from their hives. Absolutely. They also go after different flowers as well. So when you think that one or all bees would go after the same flower, actually flowers have adapted over time to attract certain pollinators, certain flies, certain bees, certain wasps, certain mammals to come and visit that flower. So yes, absolutely, bees can live in harmony in urban areas. In rural areas though, just be a little bit cautious. If it's dry, then you do need to be careful that you don't either have too many beehives in the local area or you don't take too much honey away from those bees.
Okay. Margaret here is asking how many bees would live in a hive of this size that we see in front of us.
Margaret, there are approximately 3,500 to 6,000 bees inside this hive, and they're very, very small. So this box is about the size of a letterbox, and it doesn't get much bigger than that. So a colony will usually moderate themselves. The queen will lay eggs, and the worker bees will die off and come into the hive to maintain the numbers of about 4,000 to 6,000 bees throughout the year, depending on what time of season it is and the availability of food in the area as well.
She's also asking if they sting.
Well, they're biting. They're biting the back of my neck right now. So, and they're crawling up through this veil. So I should have prepared a little bit better today. I thought I was a bit confident, to be truthfully honest. They don't sting, but they do bite. And I'm just very gently taking them off the back of my neck because they do leave a little red mark after they bite you. But generally, they're very gentle. They're very gentle bees. They're very small and gentle. They have little nippers on the end of their mouth that they nip, nip, nip. And what could I say it's similar to? It's almost similar to, I've got about 15 or 20 of them on the back of my neck right now, nibbling away. And that is about the feeling of, well, when you've got pins and needles, I would say. But on the higher end of the pain threshold, yeah.
Jeanette's asking, or Jeanette is saying that she has a small hive lodged in a small tree. And is there some way to attract bees to start a colony?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can find the opening of the tree where the bees are entering, where your colony is located, the best way to do that, actually Tim Hurd has a great demonstration inside his book about how you can extract a colony from a tree, from a brick wall, or from an existing colony where they've established. And the best way to do that is essentially to purchase a box similar to this, and ultimately you put this box outside the where the colony is located, and you create a pipeway from the original entrance of the tree or the brickwork where the colony is coming and going from, where the bees are coming and going from, and you lead that pipework into the back of this hive. So you force the bees to walk through the box, and by doing so they're imprinting their smell, they're imprinting the wax on the end of their legs and their feet, and they're kind of building a knowledge of and an understanding of the box that you've given them, and then they actually extend themselves out into this colony by way of I guess procreation in a sense. They're looking for more space, so they've found new space that already smells like them. And then after about 6 to 9 months, you can actually detach that from the tree, and the tree remains as an operational colony. And this new colony you can place elsewhere in your backyard, or you can gift to a friend or family to provide local pollination in their area as well. So absolutely.
Okay. Tim's asking if there was just some general advice for aspiring backyard beekeepers in Brisbane.
Look, my biggest, the best advice that I can provide to you around backyard beekeeping when it comes to native bees and European bees is do as much research as you possibly can, and just try and find yourself a mentor more than anything. If you can get yourself into a beehive just to see what it feels like, experience what it feels like to be in a beehive, it will give you then the confidence to go forward and understand exactly what it is that you're getting yourself into. All too often we see in the beekeeping world that if you get into beekeeping as a new beekeeper or as a punter, you then after 18 months to 2 years experience all of this heartache and devastation, whether it's through the loss of your beehive because of disease, or there's a bad season and there's a drought and the bees starve. These are all things that nature naturally goes through. So it's really important to get your hands into a beehive, do a bunch of reading, maybe even join a local beekeeping club. There is a local native beekeeping organisation here in Brisbane that operate out of Chapel Hill, I believe, and Tim Hurd is a member of that beekeeping organisation, that native beekeeping organisation. When it comes to European bees, however, they are a real undertaking. You need to know exactly what you're getting into. Native bees are very passive, they're very low intervention, they don't sting, and they just kind of go about their day. They're Australian bees, they're very relaxed, they're very chill. They wake up late, they go to bed early. They don't do as much work as the European bees. So that means the European bees are possibly 10 or 15 or 20 times as much work as the native bees. You've got to be in your beehives every 2 weeks. You're harvesting honey, you're rendering beeswax. There's a lot more gain, but there's a lot more input as well. So when it comes to European bees, again, find yourself your local beekeeping club, a mentor, and buy some books to educate yourself. But there's heaps of information on YouTube as well.
Chrissy's asking, this is probably appropriate given you're getting a few bites, whether people who have allergies to European bees tend to have the same reaction to native.
Not at all, no. So what happens when you get stung by a European bee is there's actually a toxin that is released from a venomous sac in the rear end of their body. So native bees don't have that sac. They don't have a stinger that penetrates the sting. I'm not even sure whether they even have a stinger. They could be stingerless. So they just have their little pincers that they bite with. So completely different ends of the spectrum. European bees have a toxic venom that they insert that pumps into your bloodstream, and that the smell of that toxin actually attracts thousands of other bees or hundreds of other bees to come and attack that same spot. So when it comes to your reaction to European bees, it's quite severe, whereas native bees you might end up with some little red dots all over you, which I anticipate for myself today. But nothing to allergy inducing. Yeah.
Evan's asking about, he's been keeping a bee colony in a kitchen drawer over the last few months. When is a good time to move them into a larger home?
In a kitchen drawer? Wow.
Yes.
Wow, good on you, man. That's interesting. You should definitely take some photos and send us through. Send me an email at hello@b1third.com.au. We'd love to see what you're doing, because that sounds really interesting. Depending on what type of beehive it is, if it's a native beehive, then I would be doing the transfer in mid-spring to early summer. I certainly wouldn't be playing with any nests over winter, because there's a lack of forage, there's a lack of flowers that are flowering that the native bees are feeding on, and the susceptibility to disease or struggle for native bees over these colder months is far higher. European bees, on the other hand, if you're keeping a European beehive, then look, they're very resilient. If they're positioned correctly and they're in a good area with heaps of forage and food, European bees can generally get through. And you can also supplement feed European bees, unlike the native bees. So I would say spring to mid-spring, early summer, but do it on the advice of a beekeeper. Do it with knowledge from people like Tim Hurd. Tim holds workshops around how to transplant native beehives from logs and from wall cavities and obscure, strange locations into one of these native beehive boxes. So that would be my advice, 100%.
Isabel Lacey, who's 8, has a question. She wants to know, how big is a native bee versus a European honeybee? And also, how long do native bees live for?
Ooh, so native bees live for, from my understanding, about 8 to 12 weeks. So they don't live for very long, and European bees live for up to 6 weeks. So native bees live for slightly longer, and the size difference. Native bees, Isabel, are about 1/10 of the size, if not even smaller. Could even be 1/15 of the size of a European bee. So your traditional yellow and black bee, that is 15 times bigger than the little native bees that are crawling over my face right now. And these little bees, they look like small flies, but the difference is that their body structure is different from a fly. They have a head, which is known as the thorax, where her legs are attached, and then an abdomen, which is where all of her organs and the back of her body, her honey stomach, are stored. So the separation or the difference between a bee, a native bee, and actually all native bees are different. That's just this Tetragonula Hawkinsii species. There are 2,000 species of native bees here in Australia, so every single bee is going to be a different size. For example, the carpenter bee, which is native to Australia, or the blue-banded bee, also native to Australia, which likely, if you're living in southeast Queensland or northern New South Wales, you will have seen the blue-banded bee. It's got these beautiful metallic blue stripes on the back of it, and they hover into flowers. They've got fluffy, big, yellow, furry backs and big, googly eyes, and they are about the size of, how would I compare it? A small ball of blue tack, which might be the size of your mum or dad's fingernail. That's about how big they are. A little bit bigger than your traditional European bee. So they all differ. 2,000 different species of bees, which means that there's 2,000 different types of bees, all different shapes and sizes and colours, and they all live in different places. They don't all live in nests. There's only a small percentage that live in nests. So the other ones, they're known as solitary bees, where they actually live by themselves, for themselves, out in the wild. They find little holes and crevices and cracks that they burrow into, and they go and collect food and lay an egg and then feed that egg, and then they leave and they never see that egg again. They go and do the same thing elsewhere. So their main goal is to spread their own genetics and spread more of that species of bee throughout the local area.
And last one, Mihoko's asking how healthy the bee population around Brisbane is at the moment in general.
Look, that's a great question. How healthy is the local bee population here in southeast Queensland in Brisbane? And we're very lucky that at B1/3 we have quite a grasp on all the different neighbourhoods and locations around and suburbs around Brisbane and how the bees are doing in those suburbs. One thing that I can tell you is that the last 12 months has been one of the hardest that the beekeeping industry in Australia has seen, likely in the last 11 to 15 years. There has been a compounding drought over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, and bees are finally feeling, and beekeepers are finally feeling the impact of that drought. But along with the bushfires, the drought, an ever-changing and rapidly changing climate and environment, we're seeing that bees this past season, the past 12 months, are really struggling. They are finding it very difficult. We as beekeepers have not been able to harvest nearly as much honey as we normally would, and we only harvest honey from a beehive when there's surplus honey to take. We always leave 40%, we harvest 60 or 50%, and we leave 50%. So we're never greedy, we always leave enough for the bees to feed on, but this season has been a completely different story. We've been leaving 10 kilos and harvesting 2 kilos at a time. So very small harvests this season, but our predominant focus as beekeepers is to focus on the health of the colony, and if our bees aren't healthy, then we need to step in and take action to help either feed them minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, proteins and carbohydrates so they can actually survive as a colony and they don't starve. But that's our role as stewards to the bees, is to really make sure that the colonies are healthy. But to answer your question more directly, it's been a very difficult season here in Australia and in Brisbane. In Brisbane, we're lucky that we have sun and weather like these blue skies all year round. So bees are generally very active throughout all months of the year here in Queensland, unlike Sydney and Melbourne and Victoria, where the colder months really have a snap and the bees stay indoors for 3 or 4 months over winter.
We've had Margaret jump in with, I think, what's an interesting one, which is does native bee honey taste like European bee honey?
Well, I had a jar of honey on my bench top that I've left in there. I might ask Damien if he wants to run in and grab it, and I'll show you. The native bee honey is very different to the European bee honey. Native bee honey is much higher in water, and it is much more acidic. So, thank you. We've got three different jars with us here on top of the hive. Native bee honey is much more acidic, much more citric, and that is because it's much more concentrated honey than the European bees. So European bees have a great way of lowering the water moisture content inside their hive, which means that it can be held for many years. In fact, it can be held for millennia in just a regular environment on the cupboard shelf, on the pantry shelf. Whereas native bee honey is different in the way that it is much runnier. It is much more liquid and less viscous. You can see the air bubble there and how quickly it runs. It's like water. So it's got a much higher water content. In European bee honey, you have a water content of about 18% moisture content, whereas in native bee honey, it's about 35 to 38%. So almost half water and half plant nectar. When plant nectar or flower nectar comes into the hive in the bellies of the bees bring it from the flowers, it's very high in water. So it's about 80% water, and the bees reduce it down. In a native beehive, reduce it down to about 38% water, and in a European beehive, about 18% water. So it drops about 60% inside a European beehive and about 45% in a native beehive, which means that native honey needs to be kept in the fridge at all times, otherwise it will ferment. With that level of water in it, moisture, and the compounding sugars and proteins, you've got a haven for bacterial growth and fermentation. What you can see here on the right, though, on the left here is a pure strained jar of honey, which is clean and beautiful. But on the right, you can actually see the natural separation that occurs when you first harvest honey from a native beehive. You've got this thick, dense protein or pollen and wax on top that looks very brown and gooey. And underneath, as it settles over time, that pollen-rich, wax-rich gooiness on top will actually rise to the top. It's still edible, it's still beautiful. I love it on crumpets and toast. But all of the regular honey will settle to the bottom of that jar where you can see. And then we do another straining session where we get a much clearer, cleaner honey. Then we've got the pollen. Now we can harvest the pollen as well from native beehives. It's important again not to harvest all of it because it is the bee's food. So we generally take our pollen when we do native beehive rescues. When we're rescuing native beehives from the wild, we will take their honey stores and their pollen stores because it can actually, when it is ruptured or opened, during the transfer process, it can attract flies, it can attract pests, it can attract beetles that get in and lay eggs in that protein and in that honey, and can cause some very severe problems for the native beehive during that transition stage from wild to managed location or scenario. And this pollen is very soft. I keep it in the freezer, but when I'm actually extracting it from the beehive structure when we've made our rescue, I'm actually slowly separating the pollen out from the wax. So I just have basically a pure protein or pure pollen, and it is so unique in flavour and so unique in taste. It isn't like European pollen, which is gathered en masse. It is very special. So I encourage, if you do ever run into us at a fair or a sustainability meet, even down at West Village, I may well have some of this on me. I always keep it in an esky when we're doing tastings, live tastings, and I just give a little bit. All you need is just a very little bit to get a true indication of what it tastes like. It's the most unique, it's very special. So that's actually used by, and the native honey is used by some of the best restaurants in Australia to really emphasize and boost flavour. Again, quite acidic. It's got a very floral and bright flavour though that it delivers. So, yeah, that's wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, I think this is a good point to call it a day.
Yeah, sensational. Thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. I hope that you learnt a lot. We've gone slightly over time, but hopefully it was packed full of information. Again, just a reminder to join us next Wednesday, the 20th of May, for World Bee Day. Get all of your bee stickers, your bee costumes, get all of your bee drawings ready to start loving bees and recognising bees and just appreciating bees for what they do for us. They provide us with a huge amount of pollination so we can grow food, all of the food on our supermarket shelves. We have to say thank you to the bees for helping us to grow. Again, my name's Jack from Bee 1/3. Thanks for joining us today.